It's Phoenix. I'm going to read another chapter from my book, Silent Noise. This one's called The Dionysian Tendency. And if you don't know what the Dionysian tendency is, there's not really much you need to know. Basically, it's just a concept developed by Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century philosopher. And the idea is that there's the Apollonian tendency and the Dionysian tendency. And they're basically polar opposites, and the Apollonian tendency is art and building art based off the idea of reason and a certain kind of intelligence, while the Dionysian tendency is more about passion, more about spontaneity, more about intoxication. It's inspired by the gods Apollo and Dionysius, and basically this book kind of celebrates my own tendency towards the Dionysian tendency. I tend to be very passionate, maybe not to the point of being drunk, but I'm very passionate, and as Camus would say, sometimes that's the death of us. Sometimes passion equals death. But I'm going to go ahead and read this chapter, and I hope you enjoy. Indeed, I'm starting to get more and more curious about my ability to hear and speak. As I walk with Milton, I realize that my hearing is slowly coming back. It comes in fits and starts. Occasionally, I also talk to Milton, though I'm sometimes caught up in mid-sentence, when suddenly I can't speak anymore. But I understand what this is all about. It's as if the universe is testing me, trying to get me to speak the most authentic poetry the world has ever heard, trying to get me to hear what is true, real poetry. It's interesting, as if I'm being refined with language and through poetry. We're in a pretty peaceful setting right now, surrounded by nature. I could be here forever, I realize. Milton seems to feel the same way, because I notice that he looks happier than usual. He always has that chipper side to him, but today he looks as if he could take over the world, especially with the way the sunlight illuminates his face, makes him look so real, so spectacularly alive. As we're walking through this very natural setting, I have a feeling we're going to run into a pasture soon with grazing sheep. I can pretty much guarantee it. That's the way everything is going. I can't help but think of the Romantic poets. The first poet I think of in terms of nature is of course William Wordsworth, who would write in nature and write about such trivially beautiful things like daffodils, while the average person was thinking about the aftershock effect of the Enlightenment and getting carried away by reason and rationality, as well as thinking of the changing urban climate. Wordsworth was busy composing lines at Tintern Abbey and getting lost under the shade of a tree. Even though I love nature, I have to admit that I haven't been as into nature as I should be, because indeed there is something purifying about nature, as William Wordsworth made clear multiple times throughout his tenure as a Romantic poet. We seem to become better people just by existing in nature. So what if Wordsworth was a little egotistical with his sublime way of looking at things? That doesn't make him a bad person. I mentioned this to Milton, amazingly with my voice, and I'm able to hear his response. The words sound crisp like a bird song. He says, the Romantic poets? Ah, don't even get me started on them. I try to speak, but am unable to, so I switch back to sign, and Milton, who has gotten used to the oscillation and fluctuation, watches me sign. What's wrong with the Romantic poets? My father, Milton begins, but then drifts away a little bit before finishing what he was going to say with this story. My father was convinced that the true key to happiness wasn't in skyscrapers and corporations, even though he owns one of the biggest hotel companies in the nation and is a successful business person. As a kid, he made me read the Romantic poets, all of them, including even minor Romantic poets like George Crabbe, to get my heart in the right place. I liked the poetry, but after a while I started getting enough of the Romantic aesthetic. Too much imagination, too much of the Dionysian tendency. It was honestly too much for me. So I started reading philosophy at that point, carried away by Locke and Descartes, and interested in Plato's rigorous attack of poetry. And even though I don't completely agree with Plato, think that his thinking is somewhat fanciful at times, I still liked reason. That's why I do indeed like the Enlightenment, because I remember getting bombarded with passion and imagination and intoxication and emotion and inspiration, and there was intellect, but of a different kind, the kind not given by the Apollonian spirit. That was why I clung to philosophy after my dad made me read the Romantic poets, because I felt romanticized out. I wanted intellect and reason and rationality, which philosophy provided me. It's interesting because basically the reverse happened to John Stuart Mill. He turned to the Romantic poets and altered his utilitarian approach because he was sick of his father educating him too much on philosophy, like philosophers like Locke, and felt like his spirit was being restrained. But the main point, it was just too much for me. I know my dad meant well, but the Romantic poets are not, now, my cup of tea. I consider what my friend has to tell me. And then I sign, but surely there were some things you enjoyed about the Romantic poets? All poets should be educated on the Romantic poets to at least some degree, and there's no way they take your education for granted. Well, okay, Milton begins. Yeah, I see your point. I was always fond of William Blake. Well, really all the Romantic poets, and his interesting style of philosophy, poetry, and art. His art completely goes against the somewhat superficiality and ultra-accuracy of the Renaissance and the Neoclassical era, which I like. Plus, it's so fantastical. It's very beautiful in that sense. Also, it's interesting because his title of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell is very Eastern in a sense. It's very Buddhist, thinking about the yin and yang coming together in a harmonious way. And I have to admit, his book Songs of Innocence and Experience is probably one of the best books of poetry ever written. Ever. I say that because its focus isn't like the rigorous styles of poets like Yeats, but seems to use language as a way to capture innocence and then experience, which is pretty remarkable. The Little Black Boy is one of my favorite poems ever. I love that poem because of its message. William Blake had a lot of compassion, and it's too bad he was assailed when his art was shown, criticized heavily and seen as quack art. I don't understand how Blake could go so undetected when he was helping to pioneer, in some ways, more than Wordsworth, Romanticism. That's interesting, I sign, and then I try to talk. My hearing comes back at that moment, and am successful. So what do you think of other poets? They're cool too, Milton says, realizing that I could hear him now. They're very cool. I think even though Blake was the important precursor to Romanticism, it was really William Wordsworth who helped the movement stand strong on its feet. Wordsworth is constantly criticized as being false Romanticism, but that doesn't even make sense, considering what he pioneered and his beautiful theories on poetry. I like how Blake and Wordsworth share that attempt to bring language back to the common man, to make language common and down to earth. But of course, you always have the iconoclast within a movement, and that was of course Keats, with his negative capability, hating the egotistic nature of Wordsworth and his sublime. I think Keats himself was a good poet as well, though not as rigorous as Wordsworth in style. I do think, though, that Keats was more enthusiastic than Wordsworth, with the exception of some of his sadder poems, like his Nightingale poem. So you probably read Byron as well, right? I sign, because I can't talk and my hearing is fading. Of course I read Byron, Milton signs. Where would we be without the Byronic hero? I think Byron, as crazy as he was, still had a good heart. He reminds me of Sidney in some ways, what with his determination and sensibility, but I'd say that Byron was a little more extreme. Nonetheless, he wrote really eloquent poetry, which contradicts in an interesting way his life and personality. Then of course there's Shelley, and what would we do without his style? He was still nonetheless the poet that I was interested least in. I found myself thinking that his poetry was too, I don't know, good but too, I can't put it into words. I found myself really liking American Romanticism though, like Poe and Bryant. I think that Bryant, even though he gets scant academic and popular attention now, was an important poet, more important than Poe in some ways. Nonetheless, I really think that Poe captures the essence and element of melancholy, more so than Keats, more than any other Romantic poet. But to get back to the Romantic poets across the way of America, I definitely like Robert Burns and think that one would be hard-pressed to say that his poetry isn't the most musical poetry to exist in that side of Romanticism. Even his metaphors have music, with his love as a red, red rose. Did you ever read any Charlotte Smith? Shoot, yeah, Milton signs enthusiastically, and if he'd been speaking, I could have heard his enthusiasm a mile away. She writes some of the best poetry in Romanticism, in my humble opinion. I love her poem about the lunatic, so picturesque and ideal, so wonderful. I think she was a strong voice in Romantic poetry, even though she's kind of marginalized. I know she was accused of copying Shakespeare, but that was probably a jab not at her art, but because people at the time didn't want to admit that women could write beautiful poetry, more beautiful and flowing than even Keats. And her poetry, in my opinion, is indeed dazzling. Did you ever get into French Romanticism or German Romanticism? Like Nerval, Hölderlin, or Goethe? Yeah, I read all of them, though I have to admit that Goethe stands out the most for me. I love how his poetry could be transmuted to music. I think that's just the coolest thing. Holderlin was cool too, and so was Nerval, but I honestly don't remember much about them, which I think is kind of problematic in many ways, because I remember enjoying their poetry. Maybe it's a shallow aesthetic thing, but Goethe stands out firmly in my mind. Plus, he had such an important impact on the Germans. My hearing and voice are gone for good now, I've realized, and so we continue to sign and converse about the beauty of Romantic poetry. It's good to see Milton so excited, which is ironic for someone who was just telling me he prefers reason over spontaneity, but it's cool. So what do you prefer with your poetry? The Apollinian mode or the Dionysian mode? Well, I sign, the Romantic poets are definitely some of my favorite poets ever to hit existence. You were lucky to study them so intently and grow up with them. But I would say that I agree with Nietzsche, despite my huge inclination to prefer the Dionysian spirit, which kills me, I admit, because I think passion and emotion, even if intoxication is the way to live, because it's so genuine, not concerned with rigor, that the best art fuses the two spirits together. Nietzsche says only early Greek drama fuses both, and then falls apart later on, but I disagree with that. I think even the Romantic poets use the Apollinian spirit, even if they would never admit it. Just think of Keats and his negative capability. Nonetheless, I do think I have a Dionysian tendency, just like you have an Apollinian tendency, and I think that's super cool. I personally think that's the beauty of the dichotomy, is that you can go both ways. You don't have to stick to one or the other, you can oscillate, or you can completely stay with the mode of existence that you prefer. I think if I read too much Romantic poetry, I might feel drunk as well, so I see your point. So you've got to be careful. My only thing is that I think I lean toward the Dionysian spirit because it's so passionate, so emotionally charged, and some of our best ideas are accidents, or spurred on by an intense passion that we can only barely put into words. Reason, though, has the tendency to stifle things, I think, which is problematic, and you can probably imagine why. No, I see your point, Milton signs. I do indeed. I guess it's our choice, what we like. It is, I sign, and that closes the conversation for a little while. We continue to walk through nature, though spellbound by sights around us, and I think we are both a little intoxicated, drunk by nature, getting drunk like Baudelaire would certainly like us to be. So anyway, like I said, I feel like my passion for writing, for existence, for music, for love, and friendship is going to be the death of me, but that's kind of who I am. As I said, I'm Phoenix, and I suppose in the end you can either take it or leave it. Bad joke. But thank you for taking the time to listen, and I guess the question is, do you prefer the Dionysian tendency or the Apollinian tendency, or both? Who can say?